Welcome to lesson 4.3. Today we'll talk about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and plant dynamics. First of all, we'll look at the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi benefits to plants having this symbiosis with the fungi. Then we'll look at the interdependence between arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and plants and the dynamics that play out between the two partners based on various factors that determine that symbiosis. And then we'll address some arbuscular mycorrhizal dogmas, and this is related to how many statements are being made about this relationship and its benefits. However, there are research gaps, and so a lot of the statements that have been made are not exactly accurate. So we'll kind of decipher that a little bit just to put it at rest and to catch up to what the latest scientific reviews are saying about this symbiosis. Okay, so let's start lesson 4.3. So now that we've learned a little bit about the background of what arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are and a little bit about their function, we can sort of summarize some of the attributes that we see in this diagram. So they provide several plant services, or are thought to be providing these, and the plot will actually thicken, as you'll soon see in this lesson. But for some decades now, scientists have been able to establish that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi somehow increase plant nutrition in certain situations. So that means they provide phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, zinc, copper, all of these minerals that plants require for plant growth, and also that they play a role in nutrient cycling in the sense that they're able to gain nutrients from the soil and the rhizosphere and the mycorrhizosphere to actually receive those nutrients that are being cycled continually through the plant and the microbiome of the plant. There's also evidence for carbon sequestration in hyphae and the ability of that carbon to be maintained in soil for potentially long periods of time, and that's through the fact that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi can actually increase soil aggregation or improve soil aggregation, and therefore be able to protect carbon in those aggregates, as well as directly through the fact that hyphae have chitin, and that has also carbon in it. So when they die, the hyphae actually retain that carbon. But also this idea of glomalin, these glycoproteins that have been attributed to arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, so glues and other things that fungi produce, and that these molecules can actually stay in the soil for some periods of time, holding on to carbon because they are carbon rich. These glomalin molecules have more recently been elucidated to originate not just from arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, but actually other organisms as well. So it is an attribute that has been sort of given this unquestionable relationship to arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, but which is now being questioned. Nonetheless, there is evidence that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi do produce this glomalin-like glycoprotein that is able to give lots of carbon-based benefits to the soil and the plant. The other thing is that soil organic matter is produced by these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi via many different methods. As they shed their cells, for example, when they become consumed by other things as they die, that increases soil organic matter, but also the fact that they are able to take exudates from the plant and deliver those to microbes, and also through the production of humus, how those microbes deal with those exudates and the organic matter that is partly provided by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and then how that is then dealt with through other microbial processes to lead to the formation of humus. So that also allows greater plant growth. All these things that I've just mentioned do because they actually support the plant soil ecosystem and make it very viable and very conducive to plant growth. All this leads to, of course, soil structure as well, as the soil organic matter and humus develop and the glues are added on and the nutrients are present there as well. All of that creates soil structure and allows organisms other than the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and the plant roots to thrive. This then, of course, leads to greater water absorption for the plant and delivery and storage as well to the plant. And arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi have been attributed with increasing this water capacity to the plant, which then by default leads to drought resistance. And when plants are grown with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi versus when they are not, there is some evidence showing that they can actually increase plant resistance to drought. The other great benefit of having arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi to the plant is that they exclude other organisms that might be detrimental to the plant through competition and inhibition of growth of other organisms, and through predation by attracting plethora of beneficial microbes that will protect the plant as well and actually prevent the proliferation of detrimental organisms. So this is it in a nutshell as to how arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and their associated microbiome provide various plant services that are beneficial to plant growth. So let's just further look at how arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi benefit plants. And here on the left, you can see an image from research where they've looked at the benefits of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi application to crop production under water scarcity. Basically, they looked at how arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi help the plant through drought mitigation and drought tolerance once the plant is found in a drought situation. So there's many overlaps in these two situations, but really the main things are like photosynthetic increase. So because the carbon is demanded by the mycorrhizal fungi, then the plant photosynthesizes better and produces photosynthetic pigments at a greater rate as well. It causes osmotic adjustments in the plant, so how the plant regulates its water requirements during water stress, and also through the production of different phytohormones, which allow the plant to grow better, through the reduction of oxidative stress, through various mechanisms, as mentioned there in the image. The presence of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi on the roots allows for different water retention properties, and that's like glomalin-related soil protein, for example, how that increases water retention through aggregation of soil particles. Basically, also root structure changes with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi present on the roots, and that in itself has great potential for how the plant reacts to stresses, how the plant absorbs moisture, for example, greater root abundance, greater surface area being reached by the roots via the mycorrhizal fungal extensions. Also, the fact that nutrients are better taken up while mycorrhizal fungi are present on the roots, so that just means better plant growth and more resilience in the plant during water stress. There's prevention of nutrient loss as well when the roots are actually inactive, where the plant might not be growing, and there is no nutrient loss if mycorrhizal fungi are present there holding on to those nutrients. They also protect the plant from parasites and herbivory and increase pollination potential for the plant through various mechanisms. And so this in itself also allows greater survival and productivity of the plant. The different exudates that are produced via the arbuscular mycorrhizal network versus just the plant exudates that the plant provides, that changes and influences the feeding behavior and the types of micropopulations that are now living around that mycorrhizal network and the individual hyphae, and this influences nutrient cycling. We've already talked about the glomalins or glomalin-like glycoproteins and how that influences soil structure and soil organic matter and therefore carbon storage. And also the fact that there is a huge ecosystem service provided by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi because they become a food source for many organisms. Some organisms like nematodes will feed specifically on these fungi and therefore allow nutrients to be distributed beyond what the mycorrhizal fungi provide while they're live and active. And also, as you can see here, this extensive root biomass and the extension of that biomass through the arbuscular mycorrhizal hyphae and the mycelium provides habitat as well, not just a food source, but also a wonderful moist and spongy habitat for various microbes and other organisms. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi have also been very well studied for their potential to remediate heavy metal and organic pollution as well. And that's often through immobilization, as is the case with heavy metals, but also evidence for some decomposition, probably through microbial processes that the fungi influence, but also potentially through some of their own enzymes where they decompose organic compounds. So that's a huge area of study. Just looking at these benefits that plants associated with mycorrhizal fungi, their potential for remediation of pollutants of various types. And of course, as related to this image on the left, the water acquisition and drought tolerance, as we have described from the image here. And so these are the sort of overall benefits that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi have been studied for having plant growth and improvement of the soil ecosystem. So this translates into greater production in crops, a more extensive root surface area because there's more nutrients and more water sometimes added through this association with the plant. And so the plant benefits. And this isn't always the case. This really depends, as we'll soon see, on the plant species and the conditions in the soil and so many variables. But in agriculture, there is this arbuscular mycorrhizal potential being explored to actually reduce or eliminate use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, and therefore to utilize these symbiotic fungi for greater yields and healthier and more sustainable food production. You can see here also that there is potential for increasing yields when arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are present versus when they have not been inoculated onto the roots of these potato plants. Also, in this case, corn has been treated with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi amendment, where you can see the root development is greater, and so therefore there is a better plant growth as a result of that versus when the plant hasn't got mycorrhizal fungi on its roots. So what is this dependency of the two partners, the plant and the mycorrhizal fungal symbiont? How does that translate into reality of what's going on in ecosystems? The very sheer fact that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi have been around for 450 million years in association with photosynthetic organisms before even true roots were developed on plants. So about 50 to 100 million years later, vascular plants that developed true roots, and there are specific criteria as to what true roots are. So this very fact means that plants really came into this symbiosis where the fungi were already present and the plants then partnered up with these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in order to gain nutrients as they colonized the earth. The fungi themselves actually are obligate biotrophs, and what this means that they cannot survive without a photosynthetic partner that will provide its carbon needs, both as a source of energy as well as the growth and building up of the mycelium. And this is how these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi actually differ to other fungi. Other fungi have the enzymes to actually gain their own supply of carbon from decomposing organic matter, but these guys are actually very obligate, completely dependent on this living organism, such as a plant, that is able to supply photosynthetic carbon to them. So as a result of this ancient symbiosis between plants and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, it is estimated that 80 to 90% of plants actually are symbiotic with these fungi. And this is very much under question because various habitats have to be considered when studying arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal symbiosis. Therefore, these are just numbers that have very much recently been questioned. But given that this symbiosis is very ancient, it is very likely that most plants do enter this relationship at some stage of their life to actually gain some benefits from these fungi. And these fungi really want to be in this relationship because, as you can imagine, they rely on the plant for their sugar needs, for their carbon energy that they require. So there are some non-mycorrhizal plant species, and these are considered to be the ones that don't want to be colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. They have actually been grouped into various families. However, this is once again questionable because there are exceptions. So, for example, in the family Proteaceae, there are some species in that family that actually do become mycorrhizal and they do form partnerships with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And Hackia is a genus of Proteaceae that actually shows this. Even though a majority of these plant families have been lumped into being called non-mycorrhizal, the reality is that plants have different requirements at different stages of their growth, in different environments, in various soils, under various conditions. So at times, they might become mycorrhizal. They might actually allow themselves to be colonized by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So this is very much just very generalized sort of picture, and these generalizations don't really exist in nature. With further investigations, we might find that this is actually not the case. So there might not be such thing as non-mycorrhizal plant families. The reason why plants would actually not want to be mycorrhizal is only that they might have evolved or adapted to soil conditions where they themselves can actually access nutrients, and that's just by forming thinner and thinner roots and more prolific and dispersive roots. And that would mean that these plants are actually just more efficient at nutrient acquisition themselves versus those plants that require the mycorrhizal symbiosis in order to gain those nutrients. So this is something that has evolved more recently, and therefore this symbiosis is no longer required by some of these plants. And once again, this really depends on a specific situation as described before. So this is a lovely image just showing arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi proliferating with their arbuscules throughout a root, just to show just how intimate this relationship is for the plant and the arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiont. So how does this actually work? Because more than one arbuscular mycorrhizal species can be present on an individual plant. And different arbuscular mycorrhizal species have different roles as well. So even though we're lumping them into this arbuscular mycorrhizal phenomenon, there are many species and different families of these fungi, and they actually produce different outcomes and play various roles for the plant and within the ecosystem. And in any plant ecosystem, the plants actually influence the arbuscular mycorrhizal diversity and their ecological specificity, but the fungi also organize and structure the plant community and composition and patterns. So really, there's this hand-in-hand collaboration as to the ecosystem that is formed as a result of this partnership between the different plants and the different species of mycorrhizal fungi. And there's also, as I've mentioned, individual plant specificity. So very much this is so dependent on the ecosystem, where these organisms are growing, what are the conditions in the soil, what are the overall conditions in the habitat. Everything really plays a role in determining the symbiosis. There is also variation in colonization based on season and the developmental stages of the plant. For example, during seedling growth versus mature plants. It's also very much site-specific, so it's edaphic in its nature. Also, the plant nutrient requirements change throughout the plant's growth cycle, and it's all very much species-dependent. Different plants induce sporulation of the mycorrhizal fungi at different times, which also affects how the ecosystem is then colonized with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So it all very much depends on the ecosystem and the specific conditions. There is no one-fit-all formula for how much, what species, which interactions will happen, which won't, and why. So there is so much that is undiscovered. And it turns out that while these symbioses have been studied more in the northern hemisphere, in subtropical and tropical ecosystems, this is still very largely unknown and very largely unstudied. And so therefore more studies are required in actual ecosystems, not just in lab experimental conditions. Okay, so now let's address this questioning of this arbuscular mycorrhiza phenomenon, which is the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi partnering up with plants, and how those dynamics occur in ecosystems, and how much of what we think we know is based on reality of what is happening in the ecosystems versus what is extrapolated from different scientific papers that have been studying this symbiosis in the lab or in very controlled conditions. So there was a paper that came out in 2021 called Revisiting Mycorrhizal Dogmas, are mycorrhizas really functioning as they are widely believed to do? So these authors have challenged several of what they called dogmas, these beliefs about avascular mycorrhizal symbiosis. One of them is that most vascular plant species are mycorrhizal. That's what's commonly believed. The other one is being mycorrhizal or not is a taxonomic trait. So therefore, depending on the classification of the plant and the mycorrhizal fungi, that is a given that based on that classification, there will be a symbiosis or not. Another one was that plant families are typically mycorrhizal or not. So that's whether you belong to a specific plant family, that by default, by being part of this family, you are going to partner up with a mycorrhizal fungi into a symbiotic relationship, or not, depending on what family you're in. Also, mycorrhizal colonization implies plant benefits via increased phosphate uptake, which, as it turns out, is actually not as common as is widely believed. Mycorrhizal fungi don't always increase phosphate uptake in plants. And the last one is ecology and distribution of mycorrhizal fungi depends on the mycorrhizal type to which they belong. Meaning that if you're an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi or ectomycorrhizal fungi, you will be attributed to a specific ecosystem. And so therefore it is believed that the ecology and the distribution of those fungi are based on this type that they've been designated into, as well as the ecological niche that they are believed to function in. So there are problems with that because these, as the authors called dogmas, don't always translate into what science is showing. And so there's a lot of discrepancies, but also because there haven't been enough studies done in ecosystems to actually say that these statements ring true in every ecosystem. So climate, soil, the specific conditions within which arbuscular mycorrhizas find themselves do not all always align with those statements. So therefore it is questionable. However, as you can see on the right, from a book called Microorganisms in Plant Conservation and Biodiversity, where the story of arbuscular mycorrhizas in plant communities has been looked at, the authors did draw out some specific trends, and these are the actual trends that have been widely established and believed now in scientific literature. So these include plant fitness, like for example, if there's arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi present, the survival and growth and reproduction of the plant is increased or ensured, that plant nutrient uptake and accumulation is something that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in majority provide to plants, through access to nutrient forms that are otherwise unavailable to plants, but also access to nutrients that are spatially or chronologically separated from active roots. And of course, this would be true given that these fungi, when present, they are actually getting those nutrients and traveling further from the plant and therefore increasing that root surface area by going to places and entering in between soil particles where they can access nutrients. Also, plant tolerance to adverse conditions have been shown in several studies. So, stress tolerance in climate, pollution, salinity, water scarcity or drought. Also, disease resistance has been reported, and more control of the water availability to plants via the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So plant community structure seems to also be moderated by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and that's through competition with weeds, through increased plant diversity, and also by driving succession of the plant community. Animal communities also benefit as many organisms actually feed on these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and indirectly through changes in plant fitness and plant community structure in ecosystems. So, in this paper that came out in 2023, Kuiper and Jansa actually look at the arbuscular mycorrhiza advances and retreats in our understanding of the ecological functioning of the mother of all root symbioses. So they very much look at the evidence and examine whether those dogmas have substance to them. So there is a lovely diagram there where they've looked at the ecological functions of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and you can just read that for yourself here. These are the different aspects. Soil environment and context and heterogeneity is important to look at, and how that relates to the actual fungi that are present in that soil and their relationship to the host plant, and how that then affects the soil once again, and how these dynamics work. And that, of course, includes the other organisms that are present in this relationship as well, like bacteria, fungi, nematodes, insects, protists. And so it's all about the different ecological or the relationship-based effects of the different organisms on one another, and how that affects the entire soil ecosystem. But these authors have basically taken on those dogmas and tried to decipher how much of those can be substantiated by scientific facts from the studies that they've looked at, that they've reviewed. And the notion is that, yes, most vascular plant species have some form of mycorrhizal symbiosis, and the most common symbiosis is that with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, that the plant genus can comfortably predict mycorrhizal status. However, there are also exceptions when plants are found in very specific conditions. So, for example, a plant might grow in agricultural soil where it is fed with excessive amounts of phosphate, and therefore it might not want to collaborate with a mycorrhizal partner because it's getting that phosphate from fertilizers. So that's just an example of where, in specific situations, even the plant genus cannot actually predict the status, but usually we know that that particular genus will form a mycorrhizal relationship given the chance. Also, arbuscular mycorrhizal colonization often does lack phosphate uptake benefits. So that's something that is widely believed, that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, when present, will always increase phosphate uptake. But sometimes plants don't actually receive phosphate from their mycorrhizal partners. So therefore, phosphate uptake is once again a very specific thing that needs to be looked at in specific environments and in specific situations, because there is not always a given that when an arbuscular mycorrhizal plant is colonized by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, that extra phosphate will be provided to the plant. Certainly, this is more common when plants actually grow in low phosphate environments. Then oftentimes the fungi will actually provide that benefit and increase the phosphate uptake by the plant. Also, they have made a very clear statement that it is imperative to actually conduct ecophysiological research in realistic conditions, not just in lab situations or glasshouse conditions, and therefore obtain quantification of arbuscular mycorrhizal functions in real ecosystems. So there's lots of study to still be done, and we just have to be careful with how we communicate these extrapolations from masses of data that isn't really showing the whole picture and is not pertaining to specific conditions in specific ecosystem types. So that's pretty much it for dispelling or trying to explain this current situation that we have, with many statements being made about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and their benefits. And the plot does thicken as we go into our next lesson, which will be lesson 4.4, and we'll be talking about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi hyphosphere microbiome. So basically, you can see hyphae growing here and here as well, and each of those hyphae or the hyphal network will have specific microbiome, microorganisms that will be attracted to that, as opposed to what the root itself attracts. So there's a big distinction made there, and will further help us understand how the nutrient cycling between the plant and the mycorrhizal fungi actually happens. Okay, so I'll see you in lesson 4.4.